Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in on this virtual Flash Memory Summit 2020 talk. I'm Naveshri Prem, and I'll be giving the talk titled Machine Learning for Bad Page Prediction in Flash. This was a part of my master's thesis work conducted at Center for Memory and Decoding Research, University of California, San Diego, under the guidance of Professor Paulette Siegel and supported by our industry partners. I'll first give an overview of this talk. I'll start my talk with giving a brief overview of the motivation to this work and then talk about the problem setting, the data set collected, the characteristic of the data set collected, and the labeling process performed. I'll then talk about a class of learning techniques catered to class imbalance problem. I'll then present a few of the results obtained and conclude my talk with few of the extensions to this work. So flash memories, as we know, are prone to failures resulting from wear and tear of the floating gates, gradual charge leakage, intercell interference, and so on. And these failures result in an increased bit error count. We know to correct the errors in flash, the devices are equipped with error correction engines. And these error correction engines have a certain correction capability. And once the error counts exceed this threshold, the data is non-retrievable. And it's also observed that there is variance in the error behaviors for different parts of the memory. And the existing solutions to understand these error behaviors are based on statistical estimations. So here we aim to learn these error behaviors using machine learning techniques. So flash memory that we've used in this current work is a 1x nanometer 3-level cell memory, or commonly known as a TLC memory. The figure represents the different states a TLC memory can be programmed to. A single cell in a TLC memory stores 3 bits of information. Now I'll go over a few terminologies. So a unit of a program is called as a word line. The unit of erase is called as a block. The unit of read is called as a page. And pages are further divided into frames, which form the unit for ECC engines, or otherwise known as the code word for the ECC. The total number of errors in a page is called as a page bit error count, and total number of errors in a frame is called as a frame bit error count. This data set that we've collected is to understand the error behaviors resulting from continuous program and erase operations on the memory. And the term a single P cycle is defined as a single erase operation followed by a program operation on a page. So in the experimental setup, after every 100 P cycles, we read the data out from the memory, and the data was then compared with the pseudo-random data which was used to program. And we then compute the frame bit error count and the page bit error count. And the figure on the slide is a plot of the page error counts over P cycle count for few pages in the data set. Now we can observe that the different pages have variation in the error count behavior. Now, for learning the error behaviors, we start with understanding two particular behaviors. The first scenario that we've interested is learning the average error count behaviors. So most flash memory systems are equipped with multi-rate ECC engine or features that support different correction capabilities. The higher correction capability engines require either more data or more power or more clock cycles. Thus, the systems sequentially runs the engines from lower correction capability to higher correction capability engines. So predicting the average error count would be a helpful information in picking the correct ECC engine and thus reducing the wasted clock cycles for running the lower engines. So the graph on the plot plots the error count curve for a page in blue, and the orange curve plots the error count averaged over 1000 P cycles. And we are interested to understand and learn these orange curves. So we translate the scenario 1 learning into a classification problem. So we begin with formulating it as a binary classification of the average error count for a fixed p-cycle window. So the aim of the classifier is to correctly classify the average error count into two classes. So we define the two classes as the average bad frame or average good frame, or an average bad page and an average good page. So an average bad frame is defined as a frame with average error within a p-cycle window t to t plus w higher than a specified threshold, and an average good frame is defined as a frame with average error within a p-cycle window t to t plus w lower than a specified threshold. Here on the plot, an average bad frame is labeled as 1, an average good frame is labeled as 0. So the blue curve is labeled as a bad frame and green curve is labeled as a good frame. And the labeling window for the plot is 9K to 10K p cycles. Now, if we zoom in on the plot, we can observe that the green curve exceeds the threshold at some points, but the average error count is lower than the threshold, whereas the average error count of the blue curve is higher than the threshold, represented by the dashed blue lines. Now moving on to the second scenario. Here we aim to learn the max error count behavior. So when the bit error counts exceed the error correction capability of all the engines in the system, we lose the capability to retrieve the data written to the flash. So predicting such scenario would help in giving us important information that can be used as inputs to algorithms designed to avoid scenarios of non-retrievable data. So in the plot here, the orange line is the max correction capability of a certain system, and the blue curve is the page bit error count. And we can observe that this page error count exceeds the threshold in the p-cycle window 9 to 10K. So now we formulate the scenario 2 as a binary classification problem to begin with. So the classifier aims at predicting if the error count at any point in the window is above a threshold. So we define two classes as the max bad frame and max good frame, or the max bad page and the max good page. So a max bad frame is defined as a frame with a bit error count higher than a threshold in the window t to t plus w. And a max good frame is defined as a frame with bit error counts in a threshold t to t plus w, all below this threshold. So the graph here plots two samples, one labeled as a max good frame and the other labeled as a max bad frame. In the p-cycle window, 9K to 10K. Now if we zoom in on the plot, we can observe that the graph highlights the max error count of each of the curves and the threshold. Now moving on to the input variables to the classifier. So a classifier can be trained using input variables from the memory, like bit error counts, page type, page location, etc. For this work particularly, we've trained the classifier with the input variables as bit error counts from a p-cycle window t0 to t0 plus w. As a pictorial representation, in the graph, the orange markers are used to label the page into the class. And the corresponding input variables to the classifier are represented by the green markers. The difference between the start p count for labeling and the end p count for the input variable is the advanced prediction time. So in this example, the advanced prediction time is 1000 p-cycle window, and the number of input variables to the classifier is 10. Before we dive into the classification algorithms, we've studied the data set and observed a particular characteristic. The number of data points belonging to the class of bad page is significantly less than the number of data points belonging to the class good page, which means there is an imbalance between the number of instances belonging to each of the classes, thus creating a majority and a minority class. Here, the majority class being the good page and the minority class being the bad page. So most of the classification algorithms are designed to achieve high accuracy, which results in a classifier that is highly skewed towards the majority class. So we require the classifiers to correctly predict the minority class as we're interested in learning the bad pages. Thus, we need to learn classifiers and classification algorithms with an understanding of class imbalance. So before looking into the classifiers for imbalance problems, it's important to pick the correct metric for performance measure. So as previously mentioned, accuracy is not a sufficient measure since we can achieve high accuracy by classifying points to the majority class. So the criteria that we look should reflect a trade-off between the benefits, that is correct classification, and cost, that is misclassification of the minority class. So we define two terms, accuracy and recall, and look for the trade-off between these two terms. The first term that we define is accuracy, which is defined as the percentage of totally correctly classified samples, and recall, the percentage of correctly classified minority sample. And we want to achieve high accuracy with high recall. So now I move on to the different cost-sensitive machine learning techniques that we've looked at. We're aware of algorithms for classical classification problems, and to name a few, there is decision tree, random forest, or support vector machine, or otherwise known as SVMs, neural networks, logistic regression, adaptive boosting, or AdaBoost, and so on. But we're interested in learning classification algorithms for class imbalance problem. So we've looked at a few of them, and the first one being an algorithmic approach, which is a variation to adaptive boosting or AdaBoost, data distribution approach, or bagging techniques, and then SVM ensemble, and finally a cost-sensitive neural network. So before going into the variation of adaptive boosting, I would like to briefly explain the adaptive boosting algorithm, also called AdaBoost. So AdaBoost learns using multiple weak learners, such as a decision stump, a decision tree, random forest, etc. So the algorithm iterates t times, and during each iteration, a classifier is obtained. So at the start, each sample in the training dataset is assigned a weight. And after each iteration of obtaining a classifier, the weights assigned to the samples are updated using a rule. And the rule satisfies the condition that the weights corresponding to incorrectly classified samples are increased and weights corresponding to correctly classified samples are reduced. The final classifier is an ensemble of all these weak learners obtained at each iteration. The figure on the slide is a flowchart representing the AdaBoost algorithm. So now the cost-sensitive adaptive boosting algorithm changes the weight update equation to distinguish samples belonging to the different classes. A cost is assigned to each sample depending on the sample class. So algorithms such as ADAC1, ADAC2, ADA cost, all are based on the same idea. For example, ADAC1 introduces a cost in the exponent of the update equation. The equation mentioned here on the slide is the weight update equation for ADAC1, where Ci is the cost for a sample I. And if we substitute the cost Ci as 1 for all the classes, we have the classical AdaBoost update equation. So here, by incorporating the cost in the weight update equation, the algorithm gives importance in learning minority and the majority class according to these cost ratios. The next algorithm is the bagging techniques. So bagging is a data distribution approach to class imbalance problems. So bagging techniques rely on modifying the original data set distribution. There are two major categories of bagging, that is overbagging and underbagging. So overbagging. So overbagging creates a training set by data set by introducing more minority class samples by using processes like random resampling or synthetic minority oversampling. So we need to note that this technique increases the complexity of training since the data set size increases. The second one is underbagging. So underbagging modifies the training data set by subsampling the majority class. So note that since we've modified the distribution by removing sample, there are chances of removing samples containing important information regarding the majority class. The third is the SVM ensemble or support vector machine ensemble. So an SVM ensemble uses a data distribution and an algorithmic approach together to learn the classification of class imbalance problem. So as shown in the figure, we use multiple SVMs in ensemble to learn the problem. Each SVM is trained independently on the modified data set. So the majority class samples are divided into K sets, and each set of the majority class is combined with a minority class sample to form K different training data set. The K training data set thus obtained is then used to train these K SVMs. So each SVMs learn a particular relation between the minority and the majority class. And the final output during the test is an aggregate of all the outputs from these KSVMs. The next algorithm we have studied is the convolutional neural network with a cost sensitiveness. So we've performed training on the convolutional neural network using a cost entropy loss with the cost assigned to each sample and a modified data set using underbagging. So for the cost entropy loss, we perform the training using two different cost functions. First, a fixed cost per class. Second, an adaptive cost. The cost entropy loss function used for training the CNN is mentioned on the slide, where Cn is the cost assigned to sample n, Yn is the label of the sample n, and Dn is the output from the network. So for the fixed cost, we've fixed the cost for the majority classes 1 and vary the cost for the minority class samples. And for the adaptive cost, the network is trained using cost entropy loss, where again the cost for the majority class is fixed as 1, and cost for the minority class is computed at each step using the equation mentioned on the slide, which includes some of the batch metrics. So IR mentioned in the equation is the overall imbalance ratio, and the batch metrics that are used are the accuracy of the batch and the geometric mean of rate of correct minority classification and incorrect minority classification. Thus, including the batch metric helps in reducing the cost when the batch performs better towards a minority class. Now moving on to the experimental results we've obtained. So this slide presents an overview of the data set we've used. So we've collected data from 12,855 pages and approximated 17 frames per page. Thus the total data samples are 218,435 frames. We have used the average error count labeling for the fixed window 9K to 10K P cycles, and the input features are the error counts from the P cycle 7 to 8K. Thus, we have 10 input variables and an advanced prediction of 1000 P cycles. The expected output from the model is the prediction for the class 9K to 10K. And after conducting the labeling, we've observed that the training data set or the data set has an imbalance ratio of 90% to 10% between the good frames and the bad frames. Similar labeling was conducted for the a max error count, and we observe similar characteristics there. Now I'll present the results for ADAC1 algorithm. Here, the results are only presented for ADAC1 algorithm, and other algorithm results can be found in the thesis. So the ADAC1 algorithm is trained with a decision tree as weak learners. Parameters that are varied are the cost ratio between the good frames and the bad frames, the total number of estimators, and the maximum depth of the decision tree. So for training, the good frame class cost is fixed as 1, and the bad frame class cost is varied as 1.5, 2, and 2.5. And the maximum depth of the tree is varied as 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. The graphs here have parameters as the cost ratio as 1 is to 1.5, 1 is to 2, and 1 is to 2.5 for the graphs first, second, and third, respectively. The number of weak learners are fixed as 50, and the maximum depth of the tree is varied as 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. The blue and the orange plots are the test and train accuracy, and the green represents the test recall. And just to note, we want to achieve a high accuracy with a high recall. And in all the three graphs, we can observe that with higher depth of the decision tree, we obtain a high accuracy recall trade-off. Now this slide presents the result for weighting the number of estimators for a fixed cost and maximum depth, a fixed maximum depth. So here, the maximum depth is fixed as 6, and the cost ratio is 1 is to 2, and we vary the number of estimators. And we can note that as we increase the number of estimators, the classifier overfits for the minority class. So we've conducted the similar experiments for ADAC2 and ADA cost algorithms, and the observations can be summarized as increasing the cost for minority class results in a better performance with regard to recall. Second, increasing the depth of the decision tree, which also means increased complexity of the learner, the overall performance, the recall with accuracy is higher. The third observation we make is increasing the estimators produces a classifier with high recall and with a decline in accuracy. This table represents few of the results for algorithmic approaches, data distribution approach, and the SVM ensemble. Now comparing the results for the algorithmic approach and the bagging approach, we can note that since underbagging performs in subsampling of the majority class, the accuracy obtained is lower than that is obtained for ADAC1 or ADAC2 algorithm. And for the SVM ensemble, it produces a classifier with a better accuracy and recall trade-off. Here the table presents a few of the results for training CNN with fixed cost, adaptive cost, and underbagging performed on the data. So for the fixed cost, the cost is varied as 1 is to 2, 1 is to 8, and 1 is to 10. And we can observe that with the higher cost on minority class, it results in a network with a higher recall performance. And another thing to note is with varying the cost ratios for the good frame and bad frame, we can conclude on different trade-off regions between accuracy and recall for training the CNN with fixed cost, which is not obtainable when we train the network with an adaptive cost or train the network with underbagging. And now moving on to the different extension work to this presented work. So the current work is formulated as a binary classification problem, and we can extend this to a multi-class classification problem. And a multi-class classification problem is helpful in predicting multiple error regions uh, for engines with multi-rate correction capability. So in this plot, we have three samples from three different classes. Um, the classes are labeled as label 0, label 1, and label 2, and the corresponding two thresholds that are used to label them. So class 0 has an error count below the threshold 1. Class 1 has an error count between the threshold 1 and 2. And class 2 has a threshold, has an error count higher than the threshold 2. And class 0 is labeled as green, is presented by the graph green. Class 1 is the red curve, and class 2 is the blue curve. Thus, we this is just an example for a three-class classification. And all the mentioned algorithms here can be trained for a multi-class classification problem. And now moving on to the second extension, which is the multiple window prediction. So in this presented work, we've used labeling on a single p-cycle window. An extension to this is to aim to train a network to predict the classes for multiple fixed windows. Some preliminary results on multiple fixed window prediction and detailed results for the presented work can be found in the master's thesis linked on the slide. And finally, I would like to briefly touch upon another related work, and this is the sliding window predictor, which is a network that is trained to continuously predict the bidder accounts for sequential times. So to give a pictorial representation about the aim of a sliding window predictor, so we have the error counts or the input variables from x1 to x8. So a sliding window predictor would take an input x1 until x5 into the predictor and predict the output label y1 for the time corresponding t1. And then it takes the input x2 to x6 and predict the output label y2 corresponding to the time t2, and then goes on to take the input variable x3 until x7 and predicts the output variable y3 for the time t3, and so on. So here we can note that this classifier has a time dependency attached to it. And more details about the classifier and this problem can be found in the presentation titled Bad Page Detector for NAND Flash Memory. And it is linked on the slide here. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk. And here are a few of the references. And thank you all for joining in on this talk. And feel free to contact me or Professor Paul Siegel at the email IDs mentioned on the slide. And once again, thank you for joining.